those of you who are here, this is the best ever, because now you get to hear from all of them at once. This is going to be a panel discussion. I'm going to start with a question or maybe two. Hopefully they will talk with each other about the answers, but you should feel free, as soon as you feel so inclined, let me know that you have questions in the audience that you would like to pose to the panel, and as quickly as that happens, I will turn this over to you so that you get your questions answered. Fair enough? Fair enough? Everybody awake? Okay, good. All right, so on that note, I'm going to start with the really super easy question here. So each of you has talked about specific solutions to problems and interesting areas of research. But then there's this whole medical system that's really big. So how do we go from really amazing, groundbreaking discovery and research into really affecting this big system and machine in a very significant way? Like I said, really easy question to start. Go for it.
Yeah, it's not an easy question at all, of course. So I've probably discussed with those of you whom I know in the audience or on the panel, all of us talk about the fact that right now data is really locked up, okay? There are very legitimate privacy concerns, which should be heeded, definitely, although I would like to see maybe opt-in for people to put their data in. But I think right now the systems that we have at hospitals are optimized for billing. I mean, you ask, why are they kind of keeping everything in this state in which we don't combine data, and which would be very much to the patient's benefits and actually also to the payer's benefits, because we'd have more effective and more efficient medicine. And they're optimized for billing. I'm not sure how to take care of that. There are other countries where the state, where it's somewhat better because, there's the government is the payer, and they pay from the time people are born and the data is collected. So some Scandinavian countries and Israel, even in Canada, they're way ahead of us. The states have the medical data. And so first of all, we may have to do some of our research on data sets from those other countries, and we're going to have to figure out how to incentivize the sharing of data. I mean, I'm hoping to see that in a political platform at some point.
Maybe to extend on that notion of incentivization, I don't think it's just, there's data, but there's yes, why do we bother sharing the data? And beyond data, rolling out the tools as well. We're in a situation where medicine is very risk averse. And also, we don't understand, many people don't even understand the economics of the whole thing. And I don't claim to. I was reading an HBR article that said, it's extremely hard to understand how the provider and the payer system interacts and which pieces need to change for any particular bit of the system to actually change. And if there isn't an economic incentive, I think it's going to be hard to convince hospitals, which are businesses, to change their practices.
Yes, actually, I think this is a chance to plug my favorite NIH institute or center, which is NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. And their mission is to address this question of how do we take these amazing discoveries in basic research and translate them into the clinic as fast as possible. I really love working with NCATS because they're very innovative. Of course, they encounter the incentive problem. They realize that it's difficult to structure the system so that the incentives are there to make it possible. And really nothing is off limits for them. I mean, they'll even consider, does the tenure process in some way skew incentives so that people don't want to translate? Or how do we bridge this valley of death when it comes to getting things from basic research into the clinic? And so it's a very innovative NIH institute. I actually recommend looking at some of their programs. And they're very big on things like data sharing. How do we encourage data sharing? They are big about requiring that the software developed be open source, and stuff like that. So, I think we're lucky to have a group like that focused on these sorts of problems. And if you get funding from their programs, they'll sort of force you to work in a translational capacity to move that basic research from the bench to the clinic.
One other thing is that some private foundations, like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which are really going to be funding substantial efforts in biology and biomedicine are requiring data sharing. So I think to the extent that things get funded with private institutional money, we have some chance, but the vast majority of the data sits in our hospitals and medical institutions.
No, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to ask you, Matt, actually, since you've done all this work on translating into the clinic, do you also think there's pieces that go into like how doctors, and you mentioned this in your talk, like how responsible there is, what they're putting them on the line by trying something new, and how are there incentives there that you think need to be changed?
Yeah, so I think you're right now. There's a misalignment incentives when it comes to trying new things. Yeah, I think as a physician, you get rewarded for doing standard of care, or at least you don't get punished for doing standard of care. I think as soon as you deviate, you put yourself at significant risk. And I see this a lot with physicians, and I'm sympathetic to that. I think we all want to protect ourselves. On the other hand, there are certain areas like cancer and rare disease where you need significant risk taking, and I think that the appetite for risk-taking is very high among the patient populations here, and somehow we have to make it safer for the physicians to be as risky as the patients need them to be, because just there really aren't the alternatives in these cases to not do that.
So what I was just going to follow on Jennifer's comment, I think that one of the things that has to happen is the education process, particularly for the physicians, and we talked about this at lunch. I think that part of the difficulty that physicians have in using these tools or understanding the power of them is that they just don't understand the tools. And there's no way around that short of teaching, I'm sorry. There's no way around it short of teaching them, the skills, the computer science, the statistics, the data science. And I see that because one of the questions about figuring out where do you go, you want to start with the questions which you feel are most approachable. And so you need insights coming from both sides, both from the physicians as well as from the computer scientists, the statisticians, the data scientists, to come up with questions that are worth attacking. Because all questions are not worth looking at. And some of the things which I've heard, in certain cases are like, why are you studying that? That makes no sense. So I think that we have to educate physicians about what these tools are so we can have more informed decision making, I think.
Okay, I see our first question from the audience, so I'm going to turn it over to.
I want to pick up from educate physicians, because I know this is at the School of Engineering, but let's say this was at the School of Medicine. What courses would you recommend that third or fourth year medical students take to at least get acquainted with this? All of you are PhD in computer science. Now, my daughter isn't she's MD, so she's not going to do a PhD in computer science. Mm-hmm. But what can she do to be a better doctor?
So I think that's a fantastic question. So, I think there are let's say maybe a 2 or 3 tiered answer. So the first tier is, let's say, having your daughter do an extra year of research, taking a year off, doing research, where she allows herself to have an experience if she learns some of these skills. She can't learn all of them, but she can learn some important ones. The next level would be to say, okay, why don't we have a formal master's program, right? From the MD side, where we have MD students getting master's degrees in computer science, data science, statistics, or what have you. And we talked about this also at lunch. So the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, is setting up a medical school. It's going to take its first class, I think, the fall of this year. And they made the explicit statement that what they want to do is train engineering physicians. In other words, they want to train physicians who are engineers. And so they have about 5 or 6 different focus areas. And the idea is to produce a cohort of people for whom this is just everyday walking around basic language, right? Texas A&M is doing something similar. They just hired Rod Pettigrew, who was just the director of NIBIB. He just moved there to become the dean of the Texas A&M Medical School, and they're doing something very, very similar. So I think we have to make an overt effort And then the third tier, which the one I wanted to get to, is we have to push the education of these quantitative sciences, not just into the colleges, but also into the high schools and elementary schools. And I'm thinking specifically about like statistics and probability. I mean, because there's no way in the world that folks can have these, think that all of a sudden they can manipulate these very advanced concepts when they haven't been trained in them.
One thing
To be a good patient, even, not just to be a good doctor. To be a good patient, we should be teaching people basic probability and statistics in high school, because patients now are faced with decisions, or, when people get sick, they go and they try to figure out what a reasonable course of treatment might be. And if they don't understand probability and statistics, they're going to have a hard time sorting through all of it. And I even wonder whether that should not be a prerequisite for medical school, whether we shouldn't make just a semester of probability and statistics a prerequisite for medical school, because how can you be a physician and interpret all the stuff in your field that is coming out without some appreciation of statistics?
One thing I'll add to that, in addition to the technical skills and statistics and probability, is working in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams. This also came up at lunch, where it's not really reasonable to expect students from medical school to come out as machine learning experts. That's not what they're going to school to do. But if they have to take a course in which they interact with somebody who's doing more machine learning, or trail someone who's doing machine learning, and learn to speak their language well enough to understand what this person means when they say something and do the same thing back, I think that's the huge piece, and that's an important part of the engineering mindset, that you don't need to know how every piece of the system works, but you have to make sure that the pieces glue together so that the whole thing functions as a whole.
Zach is trembling up there.
Just to answer the question of the gentleman before about medical school.
This is getting taped, so don't you want your words?
We need a microphone.
Yes, for posterity. I know you can talk loud, but for
All right,
posterity.
so in response to the gentleman who asked an excellent question about medical students, first of all, I agree completely with what Emery said about those multiple tiers, and he also didn't let on to the fact that there is a division of Harvard and MIT called the Division of Health Sciences and Technology that was founded in the 1970s that seeks to actually treat train MDs in exactly that fashion. But even more recently, whereas I don't know about Emery, but I remember when I was a first-year medical student, and when I came back from my PhD, if you talked about math or computer science, you'd engender a wince or a hiss. And so I was quite surprised by the following thing. Harvard Medical School has changed its curriculum. First year is didactic as always. Second year is now all the clinical rotations that used to be in the third year. And in the third year now, we have a bunch of electives, including research electives. And among the 6 or 10 electives offered is one in computationally enabled medicine for the first time ever. And here's the interesting thing. We made as a prerequisite for this course that you had to be able to program in R and that you had to know introductory biostatistics. I was sure that we would get very few people. Turns out we have more students registered for the course that starts in 1 week than any other third-year course, including neuroscience, including genetics, including immunology. So a lot of my pessimism about medical students has actually gone away because, like everybody else, they're looking younger and younger and more with it than my peers. And so I think we will see that change, and I think that some of the most enterprising and successful medical students are already reaching out in exactly the way you would hope your daughter is going to do so.
Okay, now we can take the question over here. The microphone's coming to you.
I'm fascinated by this idea that you got a lot of data there, you'd like to be able to get at it and get it released and maybe have people release the data. I'm coming here as an aging patient, trying to figure out, as my frequency of issues increases with the years, how to keep up and try to recover some of my youthful health. I watched, Dr. Brown, as you presented all of this data and all these different factors, and towards the end you made a long bar graph across the bottom with 3 different variables that just came and marched in step. I'm pretty sure that when you were figuring out how to get to that, you saw a lot of numbers and you finally figured out how to present that data so that it spoke and reconfirmed what you wanted to. But now today, we've got a large public that's wearing that's carrying all these wearable devices and collecting data. What's happening to that? The marketing world has taken and turned it into a social enterprise and see who can compare their athletic endeavors most eagerly. And they haven't figured out to do anything like you did, Dr. Brown, where you present the data and begin to probably monitor it online or in real time, and then collect it up into comparable things so you can filter it down and get the data that you'd like to get. I think to be good patients and knowledgeable patients, you need to be able to share real data. But from a doctor's point of view, it's very time consuming. How do you give these people the data? How do you interpret it? How do you be careful that they don't alarm you with some buzzer that went off for them last week because Fitbit had a bug in its software, and every doctor in the nation gets called by their patients and say, I'm dying, and they weren't. But there's some major complications here, but there's a huge win in terms of giving the patient the information that they might be better patients if they had it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. So let's just take a very concrete example. So just recently, the recommendations for the definition of high blood pressure were just changed. So it used to be 140/90. If you're above that, you had high blood pressure. Now it's 130/80. What that meant is that probably 95% of the people over 60 just became hypertensive, by definition. Now, having said that, one of the things that you could do, imagine you do take your blood pressure regularly. So this is very concrete. I would argue that most clinicians probably do not have a real sense of how their patient's blood pressure varies throughout the course of the day. So if you had one of these devices, which just 3 times a day measured your pressure and then just transmitted it to your physician, he or she could then see it and interpret it. And you get the feedback too, like what sorts of things have I been doing? So that's something which I see as being, very practical and has, tremendous implications, because we know that the 2 biggest predictors of stroke are high blood pressure and essentially diabetes. If we could control those, we would reduce the, stroke rate in the United States, tremendously. And something similar for control of blood sugar. Now that's a little bit harder, but still, hypertension being the silent killer that it is, I think that would be a very, very concrete place to begin.
Pretty soon we're going to be at the point where, reasonably priced Fitbit types of devices monitor your blood sugar from the oxygenation, your hemoglobin is oxygenated or not. And so you'll be able to see that just, through your skin from the color of your blood. So you will also be able to have good indicators of blood sugar, 24/7, or reasonable indicators of blood sugar 24/7, which, as you say, is the other really important factor. So I think but then, you want good tools, and I don't think these are hard to design, which can be, telling doctors when they should be concerned about their patients, or telling patients when they should get themselves to a doctor. That I don't think is hard. Anything that involves an intervention has to go through the FDA, and so that becomes much, much harder. But just monitoring, I think we'll be doing that very soon, and there will be tools so that it's not an incredible burden on doctors, and they'll just get something saying, oh, in the last 6 months or last year since you saw your patient, this percentage of the time they've been out of a reasonable range.
Actually, I think, did we see the articles about the playoff game last weekend between the Saints and the Vikings, and how a whole bunch of Apple Watches thought that the viewers were having heart attacks? Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, apparently a lot of them went off because they've got these monitors to check for these conditions. And I guess it was that stressful of a game. I didn't see it, but
It was a good one.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that the issues of false positives are real, and they'll have to be dealt with before that it's able to be integrated in any meaningful way into medical practice. Because I think a lot of doctors have alert fatigue right now. Patients do too, I guess. I mean, we all kind of have it at this point. And so making sure that the alerts show up at the right time, I think, is really critical to getting that widely accepted.
Okay, so let's play for the next 5 minutes or so. Let's play the startup game, which is going to go as follows. You can have any of the data that you could imagine collecting from wearables and all of the data that John Brownstein talked about, right? What I'm going to call the non-traditional medical data. So we're going to include wearables and then all the social media, right? The tweets and the Facebook postings and all that. And what we're going to do is play, here's the app I want to build with that data. Okay, now I will spare you from my humming the Jeopardy song. I'm going to let the panelists go first, but then the audience is allowed to play too. So what apps do you want to build?
Here's what I want. I think I've said this at other places before. I want an app that will connect patients based on their Google search history for symptoms, particularly for rare disease. I think that your search history is a pretty interesting digital phenotype, particularly when you get into the rare disease space. And I'm pretty confident that you could make matches in this community if all you had access to was their respective search histories.
Cool.
I would actually really agree with that. I've got a researcher in my Israel lab. I have a small Israel lab, which is not one of my big 3 labs. Elad Yom Tov, who actually is a close colleague of John's, and he has found so many interesting. He can estimate whether someone is anorexic, whether they have postpartum depression, whether they have drug interactions, just all kinds of things from their search history. I don't recall the name of the book, but his last name is YOM-TOV. And he wrote about 100-page book a couple of years ago. It was reviewed very favorably by The Economist and other places. So it's for the general public, just letting you begin to appreciate how much information is in your search history. And your search history also can, it typically is the case that only repeated searches lead to, or related searches lead to meaningful outcomes. So it's not the case that if you put in some bizarre thing, you automatically get an alert. It's from, ongoing. So anyway, I think that would be fantastic. I'm wondering how we get that information to patients in a reasonable way without alarming them.
So I think this general idea is kind of around cohort selection, right? Or like finding the people who are similar to you in various ways. We've done some work with social media forum posts to find this sort of thing because people give very detailed descriptions of what's going on with them or their kid. Spent time Googling for very specific things. And if you could find those groups of people more effectively, I think that would be huge. And then in the other space, the more continuous feature space, I think there's also tremendous opportunity for the same idea of cohort selection in finding people who have similar baseline levels of various things that you do. I noticed this during my pregnancy where I was getting all sorts of recommendations that didn't make sense. And I'm pretty sure it was because all of the baselines were out of whack. Actually, I know it's because the baselines were out of whack, and I read those research papers because I'm that sort of person. And I think being able to find people who have similar physiology as you, based on all of your markers that you're recording, can be huge.
So I'm an inpatient physician, so I showed you what problems I want to solve. I just want to get that monitoring correct. I think that it's very low-hanging fruit. It's a very cheap monitor. It's one that, the information yield is extremely high. And again, as I said earlier, it's ironic that the strongest EEG signal coming out of the brain is that under anesthesia, and it's not used. And so, and you saw it. I mean, that's why I like the video there. Any other time that you use EEG, you have movement artifact. And we saw that when the drugs took over, all the movement artifact disappeared, and what you have is essentially a pure signal. So I think that if we can't come up with a way to make it better for physicians, anesthesiologists to monitor patients under anesthesia, then all these other things that the EEG is being used for, I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. And the folks who are losing out are really the patients, because you can look at any study, you pick whatever one you want. 20 to 40% of people over the age of 60 will have some sort of brain dysfunction after anesthesia and surgery. I mean, but some component of it has to be related to the anesthesia.
How long term?
It can.
Some of us are getting a little nervous here.
Yeah. No,
can
seriously.
It can vary, but it can be just as a few hours, let's say, being delirious, or some things which go on for months or don't really ever come back to baseline. And I'm sure all of us have heard stories where someone says, Uncle Harry just doesn't seem like himself after he had cabbage, had a coronary artery bypass. I mean, that's very, very real. Now, all of that is not just, anesthesia, but to the extent that anesthesia is the thing that we can control, and, we can maybe dose it differently or design better approaches, if the monitoring can help us, we should be taking advantage of it.
Anyone in the audience want to play the startup game? You have all this data at your disposal.
I'd like you erudite folks to find people that are out there following these wearables who are interested in more than just the social media level data, that actually take the kind of scientific data you're used to working with, present it in ways that you and even a common, curious, trained person could begin to compare, so that if you figured out that there's 20 body variables that you'd like to track, you could begin to pull them all together quickly and in summary in real time, and then in a more permanent form, so you could add comments, add your journals, actually do the kind of research projects that you guys systematically build, but let the common citizen do that. And if you could find the people that are doing that and nurture and encourage them, you'd get past the social media level and on to a scientific level. I know, Dr. Brown, you do some work at MIT, and the Media Lab has done some work on this, is pretty good at it, I think. And they need to be helped to get traction. That's my startup idea.
Okay. I think this gentleman here, question about
We got one in the front and then one way in the back. So maybe you can take the front. Right here. Right.
Whoa! Let's be in the front row.
So one problem I've noticed is that knowledge is one thing, but actually doing something about it are different. So example, people know eating too much sugar is bad or smoking is bad. So how do you actually change that? So one of the things was using this information to be able to track to see if people are adhering to good behaviors, creating some sort of incentive for them to actually implement that, because I think that that's one thing that I think we tend to lose sight of as well, looking at the machine learning applications.
I have a new startup idea then. I want my Apple Watch to electrocute me when I eat too much. that would be great.
So actually, Elad Yom Tov, who I just mentioned a little while ago, has been using reinforcement learning with mobile phones. He's working with hospital systems in Israel, and I think Kaiser even wanted to implement it. Not everybody reacts the same way to the same prompts at the same time. So he was working with diabetics to try to get them to exercise more. Very important in diabetes management. And, if you're like hyper competitive and you're told that, 80% of your cohort is doing better than you, they're doing more exercise than you, and like me, I don't want anybody to beat me in anything. I'm going to go out and I'm going to run, okay? So other people are like, oh my God, I'm already in the bottom 20%, I give up, okay? And it becomes more subtle than that because different prompts at different times of day or in different sequences. So reinforcement learning is a kind of machine learning where it explores and learns from the feedback that it gets. And so he started using reinforcement learning, and it was much, much better than any kind of standard program in getting people to have the right behavior. So I think something that learns you and what incents you, what motivates you, is really, I don't know what to, I mean, I have another researcher in my New York lab who, what he does, he worked with several people, he's a behavioral psychologist. When you weigh yourself each morning, it extrapolates how you're going to look if you have that weight change for an extended period. And it actually takes your body type. So it's not it takes your body type and it builds from your body type. There were like 200 different body types and they characterized people. And it takes your face and it shows you yourself. So there are all kinds of things you can try to do to not eat that extra food or to not forget about exercise, especially if you're a diabetic. And it can learn what works for you.
So picking up on that thread and also the thread from one of the early talks, but I think is a constant, is this notion that interdisciplinary teams can do things that an individual member of that team can't aspire to. So if you think about primary care, and let's just take diabetes as an example, if you think that the unit of care should not simply be the primary care doctor, but a team, and on that team may be coaches, may be access to diabeticians, psychosocial assistants, and so forth. The most interesting work going on now, I think, is you take a tablet-based software, it's very much along the lines, and you do what the doctor does with the diabetic, which is, let's sit down, you've had your physical, let's talk about where you are. I need you to eat less, we need to lose a little weight, let's bring down the blood pressure, et cetera. But you agree with them about what the plan is going to be. You're at 160 over 90, what do you think let's think about 160 over, or 155 over something. You do that with weight. What time of day do you want to weigh yourself? You think about it with respect to medical administration. What time of day do you like to take your medicine? How many times a week can we get you to do your bloods so you can look at your HbA1c? And in that meeting is a coach. And everybody's agreed on the plan, the patient goes out. So now life moves forward, you get on the scale or you don't. If you don't, a little buzz goes off at the coach's panel. You take your medicine, you push the button or you don't. All the devices are either active or passive, but either way, that you did it or didn't do it is visible. And the coach may do nothing. The email may come, gee, you didn't get weighed this morning, et cetera. And I think, there's some very interesting work being built around that kind of thing, but it has to start with this notion that the patient needs to feel embraced, needs to be part of a team, needs to feel supported and reviewed, and it's pretty basic. And you ask the doctor to do what the doctor does, you ask the coach to do what the coach does. Twine here in town, which came out of the Media Lab, and may or may not have a good business model, has an exquisite piece of software around this. And in their repeated studies, everybody gets to goal much faster, everybody stays at goal much faster, everybody's happier. And the coach can take care of 300 or 400 or 500 patients, adjunctive to the physician. So if you've got a 2,000 patient panel and you've got 40% of them have some version of relatively advancing diabetes, that is, for example, a way you can envision making this coherent. But you have to start from the service model, not from a tech model. It's that coherent service that you have to automate, not consumer devices that are each in their own way unrelated to anything else.
That's a good point. This gentleman over here.
There and then over here.
Okay, there and then there.
I'm actually going to ask two questions, one from the side of the physician, one from the side of the general public. And I think these are interesting and perhaps pressing questions. One, there's evidence to suggest that as people have more and more access to information and more Google bubble effects, that the cost of healthcare is going up because they're demanding unnecessary treatments, that the incidence of hypochondria is actually going up in a number of different scenarios. So how do we mitigate this without the impossible task of actually educating people how to mitigate these, one? And two, I've been working with physicians for quite a while. I was 7 years at the Martinos Center for Biomedical Imaging and MGH. And I think that we have a bit of a wonderful bubble here, which is we have teaching hospitals and physicians that are constantly reading. But there was a 2003 study that showed that the average physician reads about 1.2 to 1.5 articles per year. And when you remove the teaching hospitals, it's actually closer to 0. And they really like the monitor that you showed, which is, it's a number, I got to keep it in here. How do we actually mitigate that? So it's a two-part question.
Another really easy one.
Well, I'll address the patient access to information maybe in a different way. I mean, perhaps hypochondria is going up. I'm sure it is. Although in my experience, if you Google symptoms on the internet, you always get cancer. But I think the other important thing that's happening with patients getting access to information is they're educating themselves. I mean, I think there are people in the rare disease community that say they have an MD by Wikipedia. And it's kind of true. Many people in the rare disease community in particular know way more about their condition or their child's condition than their physician does. And they're really on the front lines making all the critical decisions at that point. And so, I mean, we all talk about this in the rare disease community. We all shop around for that physician that will listen to us and work with us. Because at some point, you really become the expert in that condition. And I think that's been a wonderful outgrowth of all the democratization of the medical knowledge that's out there. So I certainly hope that continues, even if the side effect is extreme hypochondria. I just don't care, because I think it's doing wonderful things for so many other patients.
I'm also curious to, as the data person, evaluation person, if you could quantify that, quantifying the good that is coming out versus the amount of cost that is actually being incurred by patients demanding treatments versus the larger costs of the healthcare system as a whole. I don't know the answer to that, but if that might help answer kind of this question that you brought up about.
So I don't know if there was an economic analysis in it. I think Eric Horvitz did some work maybe 5 or 6 years ago coining the term cyberchondria. So he did sort of document it, but I don't recall if there was an economic
what the impact is in real life.
I don't think there was an economic analysis there, but it was just a great study, which all of us realize that we suffer from cyberchondria. Yes.
And I think to the second point, though, I think we should be thinking about, while we're also thinking about how do we improve medical schooling and improve, have more teams, have more statistics. As the years go by, maybe people will just generally be more data savvy. But also, how do we make it easy? Because every clinician wants, every person wants to make their life or their job easier. So if we can build tools that people can easily understand and interpret, maybe we don't have to force them to start reading all those papers. And I think that's a reasonable goal. I mean, kind of alongside all the other educational goals, there's a lot of work that we can do on the human factor side to make it such that these tools are more accessible to people by understanding where they're coming from as well.
I also come back to everybody, should take a probability and statistics course in high school, because our world is just becoming a lot more data-driven, and the information that comes to us is data-laden information. So not having any idea of how to understand risk is a big problem. I mean, I really think there should be a reevaluation at a certain point. It is a form of literacy that I think we really should help the population to develop, because if we don't, they are going to be constantly buffeted by data and imagining it means something completely different than it actually
So I totally
is.
agree. In general, I love statistics and probability, and I think just to be a good citizen, even outside of medicine, we need to understand numbers. But one thing that I want to add to that, or maybe or president, yes, fair, is that not all decisions need to be that complicated in medicine. And I point out, like, for example, the flow charts that are used by community health worker programs in underserved areas. These are very simple flow charts that capture kind of the key essence of making decisions that can help a lot of people. So I think separating it out and seeing, like, when are these problems relatively easy and we can make the interfaces easy, from, like, places where we really need to educate people about probability. There's probably some middle ground there, and we should work on both.
Yeah, I just going to interrupt for 1 minute and be a little bit of a cynic. If you're in this room, right, we are in a really big bubble. Mm-hmm. Okay, let us acknowledge the bubble. We can push probability and statistics in the high schools, and it won't matter. So the kinds of things that Fanali, I think, is talking about, which is that making stuff accessible, we've got to make that a top priority. Expecting people to become that numerate, I think, remember that we're in the bubble, okay? Repeat after me. We are not normal. Okay, we had a question right here in the middle, and then over here.
Yeah, perhaps I could just add to that question about being in the bubble, because even Harvard graduates, psychology shows, even if they know about probabilities, they're still, depending on the conditions, still not going to make accurate probabilities and so on. So my question is more speculative, and it's, in the next 20 to 30 years, how do you think primary care appointments will have changed, if at all?
We've got one physician here. He's not primary care at all. He's your anesthesiologist when you're having, major surgery, but you're probably closer than the rest of us.
It's a good question. I think it's hard to know. I think that I think we're going to be able to make a lot of decisions quicker about certain diagnoses. And hopefully, by making those decisions, faster, we can then get to, therapy sooner. That's one of the things which should transpire. But I come back to just some basics, like I was mentioning the hypertension and diabetes. Those are two huge problems. And you could imagine this going one of two ways. If we decide that that's, or actually forget about that. Look at the opioid epidemic, right? Right now, I think about 144 people per day are dying in the United States because of the opioid epidemic. And that's the same number that were dying when the AIDS epidemic was at its height a few years back, right? And we're not putting nearly as much, energy, into that. And arguably, think about how much society has advanced since the AIDS epidemic, how much we know, but we're not bringing this information to bear in order to actually, attack a problem. So I would hope that within 20 to 30 years, when you come in contact with a problem like this, right, you can easily marshal resources and say, aha, this is just like something we had in the past. How can we now formulate we have a framework for attacking it and actually coming up with, a plausible solution. I would like to think that a framework like that would be in place for us for challenging problems.
I also wonder why it's kind of the annual physical or less frequent, but I would really like to see that you're constantly collecting blood pressure information, blood sugar information, other kinds of information, and and on the basis of that, it's decided, hey, why don't we make an appointment for a month or two from now, or or not, and just so that a GP has a more holistic view of the patient. There are certain things that still, certain tests for cancers that we should do at particular intervals. But even those, if you are doing certain kinds of internet searches, there are indications that you can tell from internet searches a significant amount of time before someone has ovarian cancer that they have ovarian cancer. So, you know, they're not great ways to test for ovarian cancer. So somehow, if all of this information were getting fed properly, without the patient being alarmed about it, but just it goes into a system that interprets and says, you know, maybe we should see this patient and run some tests or adjust their blood pressure medication or their metformin or whatever. You know, so that might, for me, that would be a very promising outcome if that were the outcome.
All right, we're going to take one last question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Yeah.
I have a comment about big data and AI, because it looks like that we didn't talk a lot about AI and how the AI is going to influence the medicine. Of course, we touched upon the precision and also holistic view. And I actually don't think probability and statistics will solve that problem. I see that AI and new machine learning algorithms may challenge our philosophy of how we see things. Like, for example, like an artist, when artists create artwork, the artist actually doesn't know why. And from machine learning algorithms or deep learning algorithms, do we think that this person genetically, emotionally, psychologically, or what she or he experienced as children, but she could not express in world and music? And then let's talk about the visual artist. And then she just has something, which is a black box of herself. So she needs to explode it somewhere and express and let that kind of energy out. So then she created something she couldn't explain. Will that be the machine learning algorithms? Is that equivalent? And then in our medicine, for example, right now, just by knowing probability and statistics doesn't solve the problem that when I go to see a doctor, I have a problem in my ankle, but then I also have that caused by a problem in my knee. But when I go to see doctors, the ankle doctor doesn't care about my knee, and the knee doctor doesn't care about my ankle. But they are clearly related. Even me, as a non-doctor person, I totally know they are related. But I went, they did all MRI, everything. They could not even identify anything. When I clearly know they have a relationship, and this part from my own personal experience, like in China, the doctors, they could actually address that without any kind of X-ray or EGG. So that, I think there's something there, which is a holistic, which is something else is related with something else, that I hope that the AI age and big data will solve that.
Thank you. Okay. So let us thank our panelists and speakers. And now I will turn it over to the third of our organizers, Zach Kohani, to close.
So I'm going to give you 4 minutes of closing remarks, 2 minutes summarizing, and 2 minutes of a big hole that was not addressed in this symposium, despite our best efforts to actually fill it. So in summary, I think what we heard is an important unfulfilled yearning of having the computational and clinical communities come together. What we see here is aspiration and spotty instantiations of that collaboration, but it's very wispy, it's very tenuous, it's not systematic, and it's individually driven rather than institutionally supported. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one important thing we all heard. The second is that we heard a range of solutions from the truly superhuman performance of, I'm going to tell you which is the best cancer checkpoint inhibitor for you, down to let's just do well what all doctors are supposed to do. And there's a huge amount of greenfield in that area, and I was very pleased personally as a physician scientist with a PhD in computer science to see how much the computational people had actually reached out to embrace the medical. Let me tell you, unfortunately, the thing that was not at all addressed today. The economy of the United States has a full sixth of it occupied by healthcare dollars. And it's not that it's just expensive, it's actually creating huge opportunity costs. With 1/6 of the economy, there's a lot of things that we could do that we are not able to do. And we know that these are not well spent dollars because, in fact, other countries do it with much less money. So that tells me that when I look at all the AI programs that have been so wonderfully successful, like the deep learning programs that can distinguish all sorts of states that doctors can barely recognize, I don't believe that's going to move the needle at all. However, there is a system of medicine that, unlike biology, which is very hard, is purely artifactual. And that is a system of billing and reimbursement. And that is a fully artifactual system. So I tell you what the startup would be is the generative adversarial network program that creates the AlphaZero equivalent of how best to either bill or anti-bill, AKA fraud detect. Because if you look at what was the big driver, even though the Obama administration put $40 billion into incentive payments for electronic health records, the real mover for electronic health records was to improve billing. And so if you wanted an AI program to be successful for good or for bad, it's addressing this artifactual system of how much healthcare gets paid for. That's where the action is. And when I'm looking at it from the constructive for good side, if we don't come to grips with that side, all the other stuff is rounding error, because there's so much more we can do if we just, 10% of 1/6 of the economy is enough to buy yourself a really good coffee after this meal. So thank you very much to the organizers, to the participants, and to you. Thank you.